What happens when a quiet 90-year-old woman, dressed in nothing but a cardigan and grace, is publicly humiliated on a plane by someone who doesn't know her true identity? A flight was delayed, a company shook to its core, and dignity found its loudest voice in silence. But this isn't just about one seat. It's about every soul we overlook. Before we dive in, let us know, what time are you listening to this and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. The terminal at San Diego International was already buzzing, even though it was barely 7 a.m. Voices tangled with the hum of suitcase wheels, coffee orders, and the metallic chime of gate announcements. In the midst of that everyday rush, a small woman stepped through the glass doors without drawing much attention. She wore a soft gray cardigan over a dark wool skirt. Her shoes were plain, the kind made for comfort, not show. A wide-brimmed felt hat shaded her face from the morning light, but it couldn't hide the stillness in her eyes. Not sadness, just stillness, like the sea before a storm. Her name was Odella Varnell, and at 90 years old she moved slower than most, but she didn't shuffle. Her spine was upright, her steps steady. She didn't lean on a cane. She didn't need to. In one hand, she carried a small leather handbag. In the other, a paper boarding pass. She didn't check the signs overhead. She already knew where she was going. Gate 32, Altura Skylines, first class. The line moved quickly. Agents smiled, scanned, waved people through. When it was her turn, the attendant looked down at the ticket, then at her. Just a flicker of confusion, but quickly hidden behind routine politeness. "Enjoy your flight, ma'am," the attendant said, with a hint of hesitation. Odella nodded once and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, the lighting was soft, the seats wide. Someone behind her coughed. Another passenger adjusted a briefcase into the overhead bin. Odella quietly made her way to seat 3A. She settled in, placed her bag at her feet, and folded her hands on her lap. She didn't speak. She simply watched. It didn't take long for the shift in energy to arrive. Marcy Fletch had worked for Altura Skylines for 12 years. She had the look of someone who knew her way around a uniform. Slick bun, crisp blazer, smile trained to switch on and off like a light. She walked through the first-class cabin, checking on pre-flight setup. When her eyes landed on Odella, she paused for just half a breath. The smile stayed on, but her eyebrows twitched upward. A small, tight curl of doubt formed in her throat. She approached with a practiced voice, cheerful but firm. "Hi there. I'm sorry, but the economy cabin is just down that way," she said, gesturing behind her with a subtle flick of the hand. "Let me help you find your correct seat." Odella didn't respond. She didn't frown or raise an eyebrow. She simply handed over the boarding pass. Marcy looked at it, then back at her, then again at the pass. Her mouth made a small, tight circle. "This says first class," she said flatly. Odella didn't blink. Marcy cleared her throat and glanced toward another flight attendant. She gestured discreetly. The second attendant came over, and the two exchanged a low murmur of confusion. Passengers nearby began to take notice, some glancing sideways, others pretending not to look, but very clearly listening. "She must have been booked wrong," Marcy said under her breath. "There's no way." Odella was still, her hands folded neatly, her legs crossed at the ankle. Her gaze never moved from the seat back ahead of her. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to stand. We need to verify this seat assignment," Marcy said, louder this time. There was no heat in her tone, but there was a sharp edge, like someone tightening a rope. Odella didn't argue. She stood. Marcy reached out and plucked the boarding pass from her hand. Not roughly, but not gently either. A man in 2C turned his head. A woman behind Odella shifted uncomfortably in her seat. No one said anything. No one moved. The air had changed, not in temperature, but in weight. Odella stepped aside. Still no protest. No sigh, no glare. Only silence. Marcy turned and walked a few paces away, speaking with another crew member. She didn't look back. Odella reached into her handbag, pulled out a simple black flip phone, opened it, pressed one button, then lifted it to her ear. Her voice was calm, even. "It's time." She closed the phone and placed it back in her bag. At that moment, the intercom dinged twice. A pause, then a voice came on, slow and careful. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a brief delay. Please remain seated. We appreciate your patience. A low wave of whispers spread through the cabin. One passenger began filming with their phone. Marcy returned, holding the boarding pass, her mouth halfway open to speak. But she didn't get the chance. A tone sounded overhead. The captain's voice, quiet, deliberate, came through. We've been instructed to halt departure. Ground control will be boarding shortly. Every head turned toward the front of the plane. Odella stood calmly, still beside Seat 3A, hands at her sides. Not a single expression on her face. But somehow, every person in that cabin felt it. Whatever was happening, it had started with the woman nobody noticed. Until now. Inez Calderon stood halfway down the aisle, her hands tucked neatly behind her back. She wasn't scheduled to serve first class that morning, but protocol had her present for boarding. So there she was, silent, still, and watching everything unfold like a scene she wasn't meant to see but couldn't look away from. It wasn't the first time she'd seen a passenger questioned about their seat. It happened more than people admitted. Usually it was smoothed over in a few moments. A small apology, a misunderstanding resolved quietly. But this felt different. It wasn't about a wrong seat. It was about what people assumed just by looking. Odella Varnell, sitting there in her cardigan and felt hat, hadn't said a single word. Even as Marcy pulled the boarding pass from her hand, even as she was asked to stand, nothing. She didn't protest. She didn't plead. She just watched. That more than anything made Inez uneasy. She glanced around the cabin. The other passengers weren't making eye contact, but their discomfort was thick in the air. A man pretending to read his tablet had paused mid-swipe. A woman in pearls clutched her coffee with both hands, avoiding the front like it was a mirror she didn't want to look into. Inez had been in uniform for only 11 months. She'd finished the service with soul training, learned how to smile even when people yelled, learned to hold her posture through turbulence, spilled drinks, and the occasional insult that was never quite blatant enough to report. But nothing in the manual prepared her for the way Odella just sat there. There was grace in it, not the polished kind that comes from money or practice, a quieter sort, like the grace of someone who had seen too much to react to one more slight. As Marcy huddled with a fellow flight attendant near the galley, Inez found herself stepping forward. She didn't mean to. Her feet moved before her mind caught up. She reached them just in time to hear Marcy hiss under her breath. I'm telling you, there's no way she belongs in that seat. She's probably someone's relative trying to sneak in. We can't let it slide. Inez cleared her throat softly. Marcy, I saw the ticket. It's legit. Maybe we should just... Marcy didn't even look up. You're new. You don't understand. First class has standards. If we let people sit wherever they want, we lose control. Inez took a slow breath. She didn't ask for anything. She was already in the right seat. Finally, Marcy turned to look at her. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You think someone like her can afford that seat on her own? Come on, Inez. Don't be naive. Inez felt her cheeks flush. It was something closer to shame, but not for herself. She turned her eyes back to Odella, who had returned to her seat. Her boarding pass sat on the small fold-out table in front of her. The woman didn't look up. She didn't fidget. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her gaze straight ahead, as though this entire ordeal was happening in another time zone. And that's when it hit Inez. She'd seen that face before. Not in person, but somewhere. A newsletter, a screen during training, a staff town hall about leadership changes. The memory snapped into focus. A presentation slide months ago about the upcoming board elections. A woman's photo, black and white, next to a headline, First Independent Shareholder with Controlling Interest, Odella Varnell. Back then, Inez had barely glanced at the name. It had seemed distant, corporate, irrelevant to a new hire who still got lost on layovers. But now, looking at that same face across the cabin, eyes clear, posture straight, Inez felt her stomach drop. The boarding pass on the table had a faint gold seal in the corner. She hadn't noticed it earlier. Few would, but it was the mark issued only to board-level travel profiles. She remembered that from orientation. Inez stepped back, mind racing. She wanted to say something, needed to, but her voice caught somewhere between protocol and fear. If she said something and was wrong, she'd look foolish. If she was right and said nothing, what then? The soft ding of the cabin chime interrupted her thoughts. Another delay message came over the intercom, this time slower, more deliberate. It wasn't routine. Everyone knew it now. Inez moved quietly to the jump seat, still watching Odella. Across the aisle, Marcy stood stiffly near the curtain, arms folded, jaw clenched. She looked confident to the untrained eye, but Inez saw it, the slight twitch at her temple, the tightness in her throat. Then came the second chime. The door at the front of the aircraft opened, not with the casual swing of a last-minute passenger, but with the purpose of someone who didn't need permission to enter. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped into the cabin. Harlan Bristow, Chief Executive Officer of Altura Skylines. He looked around once, then spotted Odella. The tension in the cabin shifted again, this time not from confusion, but realization. Something far more important was about to happen, and everyone in row 3 and beyond was about to find out why. The cabin had gone still, not the relaxed kind of stillness that settles before a flight lifts off, but the brittle kind, like glass right before it cracks. Conversations died. Even the hum of the ventilation system seemed quieter as the front door of the plane opened. Inez stood near the jump seat, her heart tapping in her chest. She didn't have to see the man's face to know who had just boarded. The hush that followed was its own announcement. Harlan Bristow stepped into the cabin with a look that didn't belong to someone traveling for leisure. His suit was sharp, but his eyes were sharpest. His jaw was tight. The weight of his presence rolled down the aisle like a slow tide. He didn't speak right away. He scanned the front cabin, then zeroed in on seat 3A. He didn't glance at Marcy, didn't pause to acknowledge the crew. He just walked, straight and steady, toward the elderly woman sitting with her hands folded and her back perfectly upright. Marcy blinked twice and straightened her blazer, trying to compose herself. "Mr. Bristow," she began, putting on her polished tone, "I believe there's been a misunderstanding with this passenger. He didn't stop. He raised one hand gently, not a wave, just a signal to wait, and continued walking until he stood in front of Odella Varnell. Then quietly and with all the weight of the airline behind him, he bowed his head. "Mrs. Varnell," he said, voice low and steady, "I'm truly sorry this happened. It shouldn't have. Not to you, not to anyone." The silence that followed felt like it pressed against every passenger's chest. Odella nodded once. She didn't smile. She didn't speak, but the room felt like it belonged to her now. Marcy's lips parted, confusion giving way to panic. I didn't know. No one told me who she was. I was just trying to." Harlan turned to her, voice still calm, but with a distinct edge. "You don't need to know someone's title to treat them with basic decency." The words landed like stones in a still pond. Inez watched Marcy closely. Her usual poise had slipped. The hands that always knew what to do now clutched the edge of the galley cart behind her. Her throat moved in a tight swallow. Harlan glanced back at Odella, then addressed the entire cabin. "There will be a short delay," he said. "We're handling an internal matter that requires immediate attention. Thank you for your patience." Then he turned again, this time to face the crew at large. "Effective immediately," he said without raising his voice. "Flight attendant Marcy Fletch is suspended from duty. She will not continue on this flight." Gasps weren't loud, but they rippled. Some passengers turned to one another with raised brows. Others sat frozen. A few people clapped quietly. One, then another, and then a handful more, as if the truth needed applause. Odella didn't move. She simply extended her hand toward Inez, who stepped forward without hesitation, returning her boarding pass with both hands, fingers slightly trembling. Their eyes met. In Odella's gaze, Inez saw something she hadn't understood until now. Authority that didn't ask permission. Strength that didn't rely on volume. One man leaned across the aisle to whisper to his wife, "That's her. I read about her. She's the one who bought in quietly last quarter. The big shakeup." Inez kept standing beside the seat, not because anyone asked her to, but because it felt right. Marcy, meanwhile, stood frozen a few feet away, her face pale, her mouth tight as if holding back 1,000 things she wished she could undo. No further orders were given. No scene was made. A quiet escort arrived, and Marcy left without looking back. Then just as quickly, normalcy began to stitch itself back together, mechanically, quietly. Odella returned her boarding pass to her bag and settled into her seat again. No fanfare, just stillness. Inez sat down near the jump seat, legs crossed at the ankle, hands folded like Odella's. She glanced up at the control screen at the front of the cabin. A tiny notification blinked softly in the upper right corner. Barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Flight AZ-227 internal alert. Confidential chairwoman of the board, Odella Varnell. On board. She didn't need to see anyone else's reaction to know this flight would never be the same, because power, when it's real, doesn't need to raise its voice. It simply arrives, sits down, and lets the world adjust around it. The room was quiet, save for the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional click of shoes echoing from the hallway beyond. Odella Varnell sat near the window of a small executive lounge tucked away in a corner of the San Diego airport. The door was closed, and the rest of the world felt far away. She didn't look out the window. She just sat with her hands folded, her back straight, and her eyes on the floor, as if the patterns in the carpet held something worth remembering. Outside the door, Inez Calderon hesitated. Her hand hovered over the doorknob. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to go in. Nobody told her to. But something about the way Odella had accepted her boarding pass, quietly but with complete clarity, had stirred something deep inside her. She knocked once, softly. "Come in," came the voice from inside. Low, sure, not tired but not forceful either. Inez stepped in, unsure what to do with her hands, her voice, her presence. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for not stepping in. I should have said something." Odella didn't move. She just looked up, slowly, and met Inez's eyes. "You saw. That was enough," she said. "Some folks watch to judge. You watch to understand." There was no judgment in her voice, no anger, just a kind of calm that didn't come easy to most people. Inez nodded, her throat tight. "Still, I should have done more." Odella gestured to the chair across from her. "Have a seat, child." Inez sat down, tucking her legs in, hands gripping her knees. She felt like a schoolgirl again, waiting to be either scolded or taught. Odella looked at her a long moment, then spoke. "Charleston, summer of '47. I was 12. My mother and I went into a small diner near the docks. We were tired, hot, and hungry. When the waiter came over, he said we needed to leave." Inez said nothing, just listened. "My mother stood up," Odella continued. "She didn't yell. She just asked why." The man didn't answer, but the police came anyway. They took her out in handcuffs. I sat on the sidewalk until they let her go. She paused, her hands tightening just slightly. "That was the first time I learned that silence can be a kind of shield. You hold it up when words won't help. But I also learned something else. There's a silence that isn't fear. It's power. Because sometimes when you don't respond, you give others a chance to show who they really are." Inez let out a long breath. The room felt heavier now, but not in a bad way. Odella's eyes softened. "You wondered why I didn't fight back on that plane." Inez nodded. "I could have," Odella said, "but I wanted to see what would rise to the surface if I didn't. Who would step up? Who would stay quiet? And who would try to cover the truth in courtesy?" There was a pause. "I chose that flight for a reason. Chose to fly under my initials, not my full name. That ticket, it came through a corporate access portal only high-level board members use. No names attached unless you're checking for them." Inez blinked. "So, you knew?" Odella nodded once. "I needed to see it, with my own eyes." "And now?" Inez asked, voice quieter than before. "Now that you've seen it?" Odella turned her head slightly, facing the window, though her gaze was far beyond it. "I've spent a lifetime climbing through systems that were never made for me. And now that I'm at the top of one, I have to decide. Do I tear it down, or do I fix what's broken without burning it all?" She looked back at Inez. "What would you do if you were me? Punish them? or try to change how they think? Inez swallowed hard. The question sat heavy between them. I, I'd want to fix it, but I don't know if I'd be brave enough to try. Odella smiled. Not a wide smile, but the kind that carried understanding. That's honest, and that's enough for now. The door opened gently behind them. Harlan Bristow stepped in, his voice low and respectful. We've pulled the team off duty for the rest of the day. Marcy's been suspended pending full review. If you'd like, we can release a statement. Odella looked at him. There was a flicker of weariness in her expression, but beneath it, something steadier. No, she said, not yet. Let me speak to the crew. All of them. This flight isn't over. It's just started. Harlan nodded and stepped back without a word. As Inez stood to leave, she glanced toward the wide glass wall just outside the room. She caught a reflection, not her own, but Odella's. Small, seated, quiet. Yet somehow in that mirror's glow, she looked taller than anyone else in the building. A pillar that didn't need to shout to be seen. They called it the crisis room, but it looked like any other meeting space. 4 gray walls, thin carpet, a round table surrounded by metal chairs padded just enough to discourage complaints. Still, something about that room felt heavier than most. 25 people sat in a wide circle. Flight attendants, shift supervisors, mid-level managers from operations and service. Most wore uniforms, some had notebooks, a few just folded their arms, waiting. None of them knew exactly why they'd been called. They only knew the flight had stopped, someone had been escorted out, and now the CEO was somewhere else in the building, holding his phone like a grenade with the pin half pulled. Inez Calderon sat near the back, silent. Her palms rested on her knees, her fingers twisting slightly. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to be there, but when the request came, any crew from Flight AZ227, please report. She hadn't hesitated. The room shifted when the door opened. Odella Varnell stepped in without fanfare. No assistant, no name tag, no statement, just her. A woman approaching 90, dressed plainly, carrying a slim folder in one hand. She didn't smile, didn't clear her throat, didn't apologize for being late. She walked to the middle of the circle, set her folder down on an empty chair, and looked at each face in turn. People straightened their backs without thinking. Then she began to speak. When I was 16, she said, voice level and slow, I applied to be a flight attendant. They told me I was too short, but I knew it wasn't about my height. It was about the color of my skin. No one moved. When I was 23, I got a job cleaning the airport floors right here in San Diego. I walked past dozens of flight crews every day. Most of them never said hello. Her eyes didn't accuse. They remembered. I kept my head down. For a long time, I worked, I saved, I invested. Slowly, quietly. People didn't see me, but I was watching. Always watching. Inez felt her throat tighten. And today, 74 years later, I've come back. Not to take something, but to ask you a question. She paused. What kind of people do you want to be? A few glanced at each other, unsure whether they were supposed to answer. A young man in a blazer leaned forward, trying to speak with respect but not hide his confusion. Forgive me, ma'am, but who are you? Odella didn't react. She reached down, picked up the folder, and opened it. Then she held up a single sheet, an official transfer of controlling interest. My name is Odella Varnell. I hold 41% of Altura Skylines. Enough to change policies. Enough to change people if I must. I didn't buy this to make money. I did it because I was tired of waiting for the world to remember its conscience. The room fell still. A manager near the back shifted in her seat, her cheeks flushed. Another bit his lip. No one looked away, but no one stared directly either. Odella continued, I'm not here to fire you. I'm not here to scold you. I'm here to remind you that flying isn't just about safety checks and drink carts. It's about dignity. She took a breath, not because she was tired, but because she was choosing her next words. Years ago, I watched a flight attendant kneel down to help an old veteran find his bag. No cameras, no audience, just kindness. She served with her hands, yes, but more importantly, with her heart. She turned slowly, looking at each person in the circle. I don't need a crew that knows how to pour champagne. I need a crew that remembers every soul that boards a plane is carrying something you can't see. Grief, hope, fear, pride. You don't need to know their story, but you do need to treat them like they have one. Silence hung in the air, deeper now but charged with something new. Not guilt, recognition. Then from the back, Inez stood up. She didn't say anything. She just clapped, once gently, then again. Another person joined, then two more. It spread slowly like dawn creeping in under a door. The sound of hands meeting, soft, steady, sincere. No cheers, no chants. Just quiet applause that built, moment by moment, into something whole. Not for the title, not for the power, but for the truth that had finally been spoken. The walls of the executive conference room were lined with thick glass, letting in too much light for the kind of conversation happening inside. Odella Varnell sat at one end of the long table, her hands resting lightly on a folder she hadn't opened. Beside her, Harlan Bristow flipped through a stack of documents, disciplinary forms, legal memos, a proposed press release. He cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward her. Mrs. Varnell, if you'd like, we can move ahead with the termination today. The media team's prepped and the press is already at the terminal. We can handle the release in less than an hour. Odella didn't look up. Her eyes drifted past the window, toward the tarmac where crews moved in sync, loading cargo like clockwork, as if the day were no different than any other. That's not the statement we need to make, she said calmly. Harlan paused. With respect, ma'am, this could get messy. We can protect your name, the company's reputation. She turned to him, her gaze steady. We don't need protection, Harlan. We need a conversation. She stood slowly and smoothed the front of her jacket. Clear the room. I want to speak with her. Alone. Within minutes, the office was quiet again. The air seemed heavier, somehow more honest. Marcy Fletch stepped in, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised. Her uniform was gone. She wore a navy blouse and black slacks, and for once, no name tag to hide behind. She didn't sit. Odella gestured to the chair across from her. No cameras, no reporters, just you and me. Marcy nodded and sat, hands clasped together like someone bracing for a fall. I didn't mean to insult you, she said quickly. I didn't know who you were. If I had, Odella raised a hand. That's not what I'm here for. Marcy hesitated. Then why? I want to understand. Why did you assume I didn't belong in that seat? The question floated in the air, heavier than accusation. Marcy looked away for a moment. Because I've been told to protect the integrity of first class. That's what we're trained to do. Make sure the right people are in the right seats. Keep the experience exclusive. And who decides what right looks like? Marcy's voice dropped. We're given standards, appearance, behavior. We're taught that certain passengers don't usually fit the profile, so we double-check. Odella leaned back slightly. So you were doing your job. I thought I was, Marcy said. I've had passengers yell at me, curse at me. I've been blamed for delays, for things I couldn't control. We get tired. You start cutting corners. Not physically, but in your head. You make snap judgments. It becomes habit. There was silence again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Marcy's voice cracked just slightly. I thought I was being efficient. I thought I was protecting the company. Odella folded her hands and looked her in the eye. You were protecting an idea that needs to be rethought. That's why I'm here. She reached into her folder and pulled out a thin document. No logos, no fancy formatting, just a title in bold and a signature line at the bottom. Altura's launching a new initiative, Human First. It's not training, it's re-education. Not about procedures, but people. You'll start as a participant. If you finish it, you can lead the next round. Marcy blinked, unsure if she heard correctly. Wait, you're giving me a second chance? I'm giving you a choice, Odella said. Relearn what it means to serve with dignity or walk away. Marcy stared at the paper. Her lips moved, but no words came out at first. Then finally, with a shaky breath, I want to try. Odella nodded once, then stood. Then begin by listening. The door opened and Harlan returned, followed by a few senior staff. Odella turned to face them, her voice stronger now. "We don't just need new policies," she said. "We need new thinking. Starting today, every department will participate in the Human First Initiative, and I'll be overseeing it myself." A few exchanged glances. No one argued. She continued. "If we want to build a company that leads the skies, we need to start on the ground, with respect, with accountability, and with humility." Harlan gave a quiet nod. "It's your call, and it's the right one." After the meeting, Odella walked with Inez down the corridor. "I'm assigning you to the Human First team," she said. "You'll help coordinate, shape the curriculum from a frontline perspective." Inez blinked. "Me? You're not just anything," Odella interrupted. "You're the future, and the future doesn't wait around to be told what to do." They reached the elevator. Inez pressed the button, still stunned. As the doors opened, Odella glanced at her reflection in the stainless steel panel. She looked tired, but there was something steadier in her eyes than fatigue, something close to peace. The morning sun spilled through the tall airport windows, painting soft amber across the tile floors of Gate 32. There was a stillness to the air, familiar yet different, like a tune being played on a new instrument. Chatter was low, and the screens above the gate desk displayed a fresh message in bright white. Flight AZ-227, special relaunch celebrating the launch of Human First service culture. Altura Skylines. It wasn't a rebranding stunt or PR patchwork. This was something else. Everyone in the terminal could feel it, even if they couldn't explain why. When Odella Varnell stepped through security, she no longer blended into the crowd. She wore a dark navy blazer, the lapel adorned with a small gold pin, an emblem of the Altura Board of Governors. Her posture was unchanged, still straight, still silent. But the air around her seemed to move differently now, as if the space itself recognized who she was. As she approached the gate, some passengers turned. A few stood. Applause came slowly, unprompted, scattered at first, then swelling with quiet reverence. It wasn't the kind that erupted for celebrities. It was the kind reserved for those who'd earned respect the hard way. Inside the aircraft, the cabin was polished to perfection. The scent of fresh upholstery and citrus cleaning spray filled the air. Screens at each seat displayed a welcome message. "Welcome aboard AZ-227. Human First Flight honoring dignity at 30,000 feet." Inez stood near the front, dressed in full uniform this time, but something about her demeanor had shifted. Less textbook, more grounded. She greeted passengers with sincerity, not script. When she saw Odella approach, her eyes lit up. Not with awe, but something steadier. Gratitude. "This way, Mrs. Varnell," Inez said softly, leading her toward seat 3A. But just before Odella reached the seat, another figure approached from the aisle, slightly nervous, holding a manila envelope in both hands. Marcy. No uniform, no badge, just slacks, a modest blouse, and eyes that had clearly not slept well. She looked at Odella, then down at the envelope. "I came to turn this in," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "My resignation." Odella didn't take the envelope. She glanced at it, then looked directly into Marcy's face. "I don't read goodbye letters," she said evenly. "I read plans. Do you have one of those?" Marcy's fingers trembled. "I have a lot to fix." "Then start there," Odella said. "Not from regret, but from clarity." Marcy's composure cracked. A tear slipped free, trailing down her cheek. Not from shame, but release. "I don't deserve to be on this flight," she said. "You're not here to be comfortable," Odella replied. "You're here to change. That's more than most people are willing to do." Marcy nodded slowly and took a seat farther back. She didn't try to explain. She just listened. Once the cabin doors were sealed and the plane rolled down the runway, a hush settled over the aircraft. People weren't just waiting to take off. They were waiting for something to begin. 30 minutes into the flight, with the seatbelt light off and the cabin cruising smooth, Odella rose from her seat. Inez met her with a gentle nod, handing her the small microphone connected to the internal PA system. Odella paused for a moment before she spoke. Her voice, warm but firm, drifted through the aircraft like wind through leaves. "My name is Odella Varnell. I am the chairwoman of the board for Altura Skylines, but that's not the reason I'm speaking to you today." She let that settle, then continued. Last night, I was on this same flight. I was asked to leave my seat, not because of a system error or a boarding mistake, but because I didn't look like someone who belonged in first class. She paused. No one moved. Today is not about punishing that moment. It's about learning from it. We live in a world where too many judgments are made from a glance, where dignity has become a luxury instead of a right. That ends here, not just for Altura, but for everyone who steps onto our planes. People were listening, really listening. I'm not here to apologize on behalf of others, she said. I'm here to make a promise that from this moment on, Altura Skylines will work to honor the worth of every passenger, not because of what they paid or how they look, but because they are human. Her eyes scanned the rows. Some passengers looked back with surprise, others with quiet tears in their eyes. We don't just lift bodies into the sky, we lift spirits, and I hope today we've lifted something more. She returned the mic to Inez, who looked at her with silent admiration. Later, as the plane began its descent into Houston, Odella sat quietly by the window. The sky outside was soft with late afternoon light. Clouds drifted below like thoughts she'd already sorted through. As the wheels touched down and the gentle lurch of landing passed through the cabin, she felt something settle in her chest. Not relief, but conviction. A landing, yes. But more than that, a beginning. Inez came forward, placing a hand gently on the back of her seat. Thank you, she whispered. Odella gave a small nod, eyes still on the horizon. Now, she murmured, let's see if we can help this whole company land a little better next time. The training room at Del Mar Service Center buzzed with a quiet energy. It wasn't nervousness, not exactly. More like something waiting to take shape. The chairs were arranged in a wide semicircle, a small stage in front with a screen that glowed softly in the early light. On it, a single sentence. Respect is not protocol. It's the beginning of flight. Inez Calderon stood beside the podium, clipboard in hand, blazer neatly pressed. Her voice was steady, more confident than just a week before. This program isn't about policies, she said, pacing slowly. It's about presence, about being awake to the people around us. The room was filled with new and returning staff, some fresh out of orientation, others 10 or 15 years into their careers. And right there in the front row sat Marcy Fletch. No uniform, just a plain white blouse, slacks, and a notepad open on her lap. Her pen moved with purpose, her eyes focused, not trying to prove anything, just learning. At the end of the session, when Inez opened the floor for thoughts, it was Marcy who stood first. I used to think good service meant keeping control, she said, her voice clear, that I was doing my job by predicting who might belong in certain places. But that wasn't service. That was survival, and survival doesn't build anything. She paused, then added, I'm not here to get my old job back. I'm here to become someone who doesn't need that version of herself anymore. Applause followed, not loud, but real, a kind of acceptance that can't be forced. Later that afternoon, the lights dimmed in a small studio inside Altura's headquarters, where a scheduled interview was being recorded. Odella Varnell sat comfortably across from a young journalist. The set was modest. No flashing lights, no dramatic music. Just a soft backdrop and two chairs, angled slightly toward one another. The interviewer leaned forward. Mrs. Varnell, when you were removed from your seat on that flight, what kept you from reacting with anger? Odella chuckled, the sound warm and worn like an old hymn. Oh, I've done plenty of reacting in my life, she said. Anger's been an old friend of mine. But I've learned something over the years. Anger can knock down a wall, but only kindness builds something that lasts. The journalist smiled. So you never thought about revealing your title in the moment? Odella looked away for a second, her eyes catching the reflection of the studio lights in the table's edge. Of course I did, she said quietly. I wanted to. For a moment, I wanted to make her feel what I felt, to let everyone in that cabin know exactly who they were pushing aside. She paused. But then I saw a young woman, quiet, unsure, but watching, not judging, just observing. I thought, maybe this isn't about teaching a lesson. Maybe it's about planting a seed. She leaned back, her voice softening. I chose to wait. And because of that, I got to see what could grow when you don't pull the roots out in anger. The broadcast faded to black on her final line, leaving viewers not with resolution, but with reflection. Later that week, at Café Laurel, a small corner cafe tucked near a shaded park in San Diego, something new appeared. At the table near the back window, where Odella often sipped her morning tea and read the news, a small bronze plaque had been added. It read, "The Table of Quiet Power." She didn't ask for it. She never even noticed the manager taking measurements a few days earlier. But when she arrived that morning, paper under her arm and a light shawl over her shoulders, she paused, just for a second. Then she sat, unfolded the newspaper, sipped. People passed by, not rushing anymore. Some paused, tipped their head. A few said her name, but most just nodded, out of respect, not recognition. One young woman dropped her coffee lid, then laughed nervously and whispered, "Sorry, ma'am," before hurrying on. Odella smiled behind her cup. The world hadn't changed overnight, but something in it had shifted. A little slower, a little kinder, a little more awake. She didn't need everyone to remember her face or even her name. She only hoped that the next time someone was told they didn't belong, someone nearby would pause, think twice, and choose to make room. Because sometimes all it takes is one quiet moment to move an entire system. Odella didn't change the world with outrage. She simply showed it a better way to exist. Sometimes the strongest voice in the room is the one that chooses not to shout. Odella Varnell didn't demand respect. She inspired it. Her story reminds us that dignity isn't about titles or appearances, but how we choose to treat each other when no one's watching. What would you do if you had the power to change a system that once overlooked you? If this story made you feel something, be sure to subscribe, because more stories like this are on the way, and they just might change how you see the world.